Oh, great, you've arrived. It's snowing pretty hard out there. I was starting to. Well, you're here now and you're safe. And I believe I promised I would read you Silverfarb the Vertical. The cover was illustrated by my talented friend Nick Norman. Silverfarb the Vertical. And there's a picture of worms on the title page. Billy questioned just the depth of the pit into which he was to be thrown, and not a single other thing about it. Certainly only some kind of superhuman could have dug the pit. This he didn't contest. It was too excruciatingly round to be natural. Billy thought it needed a manhole cover. "You shall die by falling forever," said the judge, fat, of course, and standing so his fat rounded him like a whirlpool. All 200 jurists stood over the pit and nodded righteously. The jurists on the other side of the pit were indistinct with distance blueness. Behind them stood the black and spindly tower from whose school Billy had been recently expelled. Scholars dwelt in the tower that, like all frightening and described towers, pointed like a finger of a bony devil or a demonic skeleton at a sky that itself wasn't going to win any beauty pageants. The scholars had inferred that a big worm with hair like velvety horse legs burrowed the pit many thousands of years earlier. They defended these inferences and all their others so stubbornly that the fools who sought to debate them either tired out and converted, or panicked so hard that they longed for death to come and answer all their sad new questions. Billy, of course, was the exception, and he debated in the tower's high halls so tenaciously on the subject of the pit's depth that the scholars began to feel the same sorts of fears and doubts they normally doled out. And so they made a decision about him. Billy ended up on the prodding board over the pit on his 13th birthday, which, though it didn't make him happy, at least made sense. "I'll tell you what doesn't make sense," Billy said to himself. "The position of the scholars in the tower, that the pit has no bottom." As the prodsman stepped onto the quaking board, Billy realized he'd not have long to enjoy his small personal victory over the scholars when he alone would find the bottom of the pit racing towards his flailing body. There developing no escape, Billy did not let the prodsman's magnificent white claw prod draw any closer. He slipped from the board and began his long fall. The punishment was in principle death by starvation, by the standards of the people above, perhaps after a madness settled in. Billy had some difficulty fending off the latter. The great big mile-wide mouth of the pit receded rapidly above him into sunlikeness. Without his faculties, it would be hard to say whether he'd enjoy a final vindication, or whether it wouldn't all be dreams of insanity. Just as Billy began to consider whether the rest of his life would diminish into some sort of remark on the difference between existing and its alternatives, a splendid contraption broke his fall. He surely would have been destroyed had it done so all at once, but this particular contraption was clever and held him tightly and safely, and best of all, gradually, with a soft and delicate net, more like a hammock than a gladiator's rate. As its necklaces of pulleys drew him towards the edge of the pit, he figured he must be dead, as he had gone at least a little mad on the way down. He snapped out of it when he watched pendulously as a great flock of chubby gray feather-antlered moths leaped off the net's sparse mesh and soared up towards the pit's little moon-sized mouth. Down here, Billy found a beehive of ferociously balconied apartments. Brittle old people came looking to see what their friend catcher found. A couple of them clawed at the net and poured it out onto their balcony. "Lucky you," the old woman said. Blue ribbons danced in her hair, and though it was gloomy almost everywhere, warm light from the apartment made her and the man glow like gentle old ghosts. "You must know whether the pit has a bottom," Billy asked, leaning up on his elbows. "What an unexpected greeting," said the old man, who in fairness wasn't remarkably old, just far older than a boy celebrating his 13th birthday. When I got caught, I screamed for hours." "I'm different from other people," Billy said, more sure it was true than he had reason to be. "Come in," the old lady said. From a balcony far across the gloomy pit, a woman called, "What do you have there, Lilith?" "Poor thing," she called back. Lilith and Dode, as the old fellow was called, poured Billy blackened subterranean tea in their kitchen, also not lacking a balcony, and Billy could feel that the three of them were about to take part in the sort of interaction during which the natives explain their whereabouts to the newcomer and whoever else might happen to be listening in. "How did you all get here?" Billy asked, for example. "Most of us were born here," said Lilith. "Not Dode. He fell like you." There was no way that her tea wasn't just as magmatically hot as Billy's, and yet she slurped away at it like a fire elemental in one of the fantasy games Billy used to play but would never again. They say that not long after the worm dug this pit, a coven of pregnant witches with pointy black nails like shovels of stone were thrown from the above for obvious reasons. They managed at this depth to stop their fall by ramming their nails into the wall of the pit. "Sure," said Billy, "and you're all descended from them." "Not me," said Dode. "You're all the children of pointy witches," the boy added. He was being redundant for feather-ruffling purposes, but Lilith and Dode were old and immovable. "How come you don't dig up?" "I don't think so," said Dode. When he didn't speak, he was rather featureless, but it tickled Billy that when he did speak, all these underground dimples dug out of his face. "You are from the above, where the science of geology is probably no longer taught. The stones cleave only horizontally around here." Dode looked ashamed of himself when he closed his mouth, and as if he'd talked too much. "But you managed to dig what?" Billy gazed up at the kitchen ceiling, painted a cracked and thirsty cream color, and he calculated briefly. 7 or 8 feet of headroom. Doesn't that mean someone dug vertically? Someone knocked on the door and Dode called, "Come in," while he put his hand on the side of his face and his thumb under his chin. Billy heard knob-rattling sounds and the scampering of curious feet in the kitchen. In drove a little mother and her 3 young daughters of descending age and height. "We saw you snatch up the boy from the above," the mother said. "What's his name?" Lilith, Dode, and Billy all said his name at once, and then Lilith said they should all stay for a cup or two of that gritty old black tea. The oldest girl, Aid, was allowed to stay, but the mother and the little ones had to go pick apples. They drank tea as Lilith turned on the stove and started to stew something. "Would you like to stay for dinner, Aid? We're having legs." "Legs?" Billy murmured. "What kind of legs?" His voice trembled. He meant, of course, to ask if they were human legs. "Don't be silly," said Lilith. Aid swallowed a gulp's worth of tea and said she'd love to. They ate the stew and didn't answer when Billy asked them things. No one had ever clarified whether the legs were from an animal, and eating them didn't clarify that matter either. "So this pit has to have a bottom, right?" said Billy, his oil-dotted, stew-laden spoon poised at his lips. "Usually things do," Aid answered in a very, very polite way. "Your name must actually be William," she said. Billy chewed as he spoke. The little legs were just as rubbery as they were resilient, and so his teeth bounced against each other and made him talk and talk. "William Silverfarb. Farbs are little magical fishing hooks shaped like question marks, and if you make them out of silver, you'll catch boneless bass. And that's what my dad did. Do you ever go back up?" Billy once had surprised his school chums in the tower's cafeteria with an excellent joke. Food had teemed from their mouths as they laughed. His plan here was to surprise this group of people, whoever they were, with a question, in case from their mouths an answer might spill. "Billy," Dode said, "that's not how it works." "What about with long witch fingernails?" "It's not how it works," Lilith added. Billy dropped his spoon on the table and stood and moved to the balcony. "Wouldn't you like an apple pudding?" Aid called after him. "No!" Billy shouted. He watched his hand squeeze the balustrade and his foot leap up onto it. "I'd only ask where the apples came from." It was truth he wanted, and these people would hardly even give him falsehoods for him to argue with. Madness there, or madness below. He fell for long enough that he regretted not having a bit of apple pudding before his impulse to jump from the balcony had whispered so temptingly into his ear. He busied himself as he fell by toying around with why he no longer felt so afraid as his body plunged through deafening wind. The nail witch's children were afraid to answer questions. If there was a bottom to this pit, as Billy supposed, then the chance awaited him of a brief glitter of certainty before death. Billy had fallen for quite a while when he figured out that while a pit's bottom is apprehendable, a pit's bottomlessness is not. Answers kill, he thought, and so he marked the riddle of his unhelpful hosts as solved. Above him, the mile-wide mouth of the pit twinkled like a star in the sky. Billy couldn't discern this with his falling body flailing, but when a cylindrical forest of desperate, leafless, thin-limbed trees, white-knuckledly gripping the pit's walls, slowed him in their pliant tangles, he gradually came to a stop again, and lay there with twig snags stretching great triangles out of his clothes. He gazed up, and through the canopy he saw the twinkling. No light lit the trees but that, and so Billy couldn't guess exactly what had stopped him until the caves and caves he'd awakened of wide-headed people with bright torches came. They lit the woods, such as the woods were, and the trees were so feeble that Billy still couldn't entirely figure out what they were other than an indistinct web of little rough gray tubes. He figured there was more to it than that. A froggish, flat-headed specimen seized Billy's forearm with a warm and quiet hand. "Are you another witch?" "I'm from further up than that," he said. The thing that had touched Billy said its name was Bow. Billy felt he had no time to grieve over the world he'd been dropped from as Bow said things to him and led him through the caves around the forest. He heard purposeful-sounding grunts and then watched people with flat heads jumping as hard as they could and slamming their heads up onto the cave's ceilings. "Do they always do that?" Billy asked. "We'll make it up there one day," Bow answered. "Little by little, the ceiling gets higher." "And how much higher is the ceiling now than when you started hitting it with your heads?" "We've always been hitting it with our heads. There was no beginning, and thus the ceiling had no starting height to compare the current height to, and so your question is malformed and answerless." Billy's eyes were growing accustomed to the patches of darkness for which the torches were no match. He fancied he could see his own eyes glittering as he rolled them. "What about since yesterday?" "No change in such a short time is apprehendable," said Bow. If something in one of Billy's fantasy games were to bang its head as shockingly against stones as these people, some kind of brief concomitant earthquake would result. In real life, he discovered that the earth remained emphatically still despite the many heroic poundings against it. The light of rushing torchbearers shone in the worm-shaped loads of silver decorating the walls of the cave. Billy scooted out of a torchbearer's way. "Where are they going?" "Silver," Bow said. "That's where we're going, too." "My last name is Silverfarb," Billy explained, thinking perhaps it would help. "Farbs don't work." "What do you mean?" "Why, I cast one into my sink once and caught the fattest boneless bass and—" "I mean, they won't help us escape this pit," said Bow. "Only Hollow thinks that. He makes farbs and wastes all this silver. He throws the farbs down the pit when we tell him we can't use them. He has a short memory." "Tell him to stop making them," Billy said. "He'd just forget. You have a short memory, too." Bow's teeth were surprisingly straight and white, though Billy thought he could see bark between several of them. These people had very robust head bones, from chin to crown, it seemed, though also certain cognitive imperfections, maybe. As it happened, Silver was a slave sort of place, and they didn't let Billy leave when he decided that the witch's children were right that the mineral composing the ceiling was such that there was no digging up through it. Some riddle he couldn't quite mentally word had an answer in the shape of the flat-headed silver slaves who refused to acknowledge this, or because of all the head-knocking, lacked the ability to. The torch glint of Bow's teeth made Billy put his finger on the corner of his mouth to help him wonder whether or not it was toothbrush time. This was of course impossible, and Billy was made for 6 years to mine only down and horizontally. They used silver instruments to mine silver to make instruments for digging up, but nobody but Billy understood that if they couldn't dig up with silver instruments when the object of the digging was silver, they wouldn't be able to dig up with silver instruments when the object was digging up. The head knock people were happy to answer as many questions as Billy posed them, but they weren't good at answering questions correctly. The witch's children above, he realized, when he was 19 and found a deep and unforgivingly inclined sub-pit, were the reverse, refusing to answer questions to which they must have had terrible answers indeed. Sick to death of silver and loads, and having lost all of his teeth from eating for 6 years only what the hard-boned head people ate, Billy leapt down this sub-pit, determining by its incline that he would slide on his behind to its mother, what the scholars said was the bottomless. Cave angles obscured the torches and the glint of silver forever for Billy, and he found himself again falling and growing hungrier. The pit had narrowed greatly, and its sides would have sanded him down to a nub were they and Billy to meet. A comfort nevertheless squeezed at all sides of him, for Billy felt he understood well the rule of threes, and not long after his escape he fell onto a bed of soft moss as fat as a pig. It was dark here, and Billy's behind could have felt more excellent, but there was plenty not to complain about. For example, the silverfarb that his slave clothing had caught, but that had not punctured him in any way, and that he found it not by the glint of torches against silver, which would have made him nauseous, as he'd gotten quite enough of that perception during his 6 years in the mine, but by feeling around with his own fingertips. He heard the voices of girls like bells in the dark. It had been difficult to tell men from women among the head people by their voices, but here it wasn't. There were 2 or 3 of them, and one of them said, "May we kiss you?" Billy looked up and saw no sky dot above. Either it was too deep or night had come. He could not quite speak at just that moment, and didn't like the sounds of the voices who neither asked him his name nor offered him theirs. They didn't wait for an answer from flustered and bashful Billy before they kissed him, but they bit him too, and if he'd seen the kissers, rather than assume their forms matched the bells in their voices, he'd have rushed off of the bed of moss and eagerly dropped ever further just to escape them. Alas, they bit him until he could feel wreaths of little tooth craters when his fingers passed over the places. He had spent his years meant for learning to kiss, instead digging in a futile silver mine, and so did not return the behavior, happily, for if he had, this story would be slightly shorter. He didn't, so they rolled him off of the moss into the dark, and he fell one final 4th time, to his surprise, and not so terribly far either. Billy splashed wildly at the dark pool into which he'd dropped, and up from which he'd bobbed. Though his splash was deep, his poor outstretched toes didn't touch any sort of bottom below the pool. It was only about 3 billies wide, and as he smacked his hands against the pit's black stone sides, he cursed silently, for if a bottom did lurk down in the black water somewhere, he could never simultaneously apprehend it and breathe. Discovering just a little over the water's edge a small cranny big enough for 1 or 2 billies, he gave up and lived there for the rest of his life. There he spent his last 36 years, years during which his eyes grew perfectly accustomed to the dark, though by blindness or light thrift Billy could not after very long say. His dreams underwent the same transformation, and he dreamed no longer of colors and light, but of dampness, echoes, and deep breezes. By swishing his silverfarb for just a moment through the water, he brought up boneless bass for every meal he had again. Once in a while, something Billy could not see and that could not talk came up from the pool and snatched the bass out of his hands, or even his mouth, until Billy thought it would be wisest simply to offer it his food when it visited, so that its actions wouldn't count as theft. When he was just 55, Billy died. Those bites in the dark didn't do nothing to him. He thought it would be smart as his last big lurch to roll once more out into the pit, now to sink into the pool where, maybe one day, his bones would settle at the bottom, and maybe not. Well, thanks so much for coming by, even though it's so snowy outside. You don't have to, you can stick around, since it's getting hard to leave. So I'll see you in a few seconds.